Thank you everyone for joining us today for our um, first of actual spring Rutgers Energy Policy Seminar Series. Today we have Dr. Hughes, who is a professor of anthropology at Rutgers. Dr. Hughes has published articles on energy in the Boston Review and has several books, including Energy Without Conscience, Oil, Climate Change, and Complicity, which will be available in the fall of 2001, or that's the new book.
No, that's I'll tell you about the new book in a bit. Yeah.
Okay, the new book that's coming up. He also serves as a member of the Climate Task Force on the American Federation of Teachers. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Hughes.
All right, thanks very much, Kevin, and thanks everybody at REI for inviting me here. This research is going to be coming from the Boston Review articles that Kevin mentioned and from the forthcoming book that I've got coming out in the fall, entitled Who Owns the Wind? Climate Crisis and the Hope of Renewable Energy. So this is what I'm going to cover today, and I'll just go into it. So some basic concepts here. Of course, you all know probably much more than I do about wind and sunlight as meteorological and as physical concepts. I'm just going to point out a couple issues that are relevant for energy policy. They are flows and not stocks. So unless wind and sunlight are converted to electricity first, they're not storable, not accumulable, and not transportable, meaning that they're tied directly to place and directly to landscape. And unlike fossil fuels, they're very extensive across the landscape. As we know, you can get enough oil to power a city through a hole in the ground that's 30 inches across. That's not true at all for wind and sunlight. You have to harvest them from the planet's surface as if it were a kind of a collecting platform. So what I try to do in my research as an anthropologist is to understand these material qualities and how they play out politically, and explain to people how they play out politically. Overall, what I try to do is explain that wind and sunlight are things. They are resources that are being fought over and owned in invisible ways, in the same way that land, forests, fish are visibly fought over and owned. And I'd like to bring those battles, in fact, to the fore, so that the right people, the majority of the people, particularly poor and marginalized people, can win those fights over the resources of wind and sunlight, which I think, in fact, is the best way to promote an energy transition towards 100% or close to 100% renewables and close to 0% fossil fuel use. So in order to do that, I'll tell you a tiny bit about property. Property is about ownership. It's defined by social scientists as a relationship among people about things. So not so much between people and things, but between people about things. So since wind and sunlight are flows, they're fugitive in this way. The relevant property right is not actually holding it, but gaining access to it. And gaining access to it is about being in the right place at the right time, because as I just said, wind and sunlight are tied to place and tied to landscape. So what we're, and let me just my final concept here is of the frontier. All these questions of property and access and resources are supercharged on a frontier. A frontier, like the one that we know of in the history of North America. This is North America in 1763. And this is the vast unknown, and the unknown to Europeans, of the western half of the continent. Sunlight and its derivatives are like this, the next frontier. Here's the exergy chart that many of you, again, know much better than I. But when we talk about solar radiation, we're talking about a vast resource. And even when we talk about wind, we're talking about a vast resource. This is terawatts at any given time, much larger than fossil fuels down here. So in energy terms, when we use fossil fuels, we're sort of cowering in Manhattan. And when we use solar, we're out there in the Mississippi watershed and in the Rockies. So this transition to the renewable energy frontier is as epic, I think, as what Europeans encountered as they expanded and seized land from native people and colonized and converted the Americas. Okay, so this process can happen in a more just way or in a less just way. I'm going to try to recommend and explain to you some of the more just routes, which are a little bit different for wind and sunlight. I'm also going to suggest that the route that we're on is not just and is in fact self-defeating, that people will not allow, people with the ability in democracies especially to block renewables are going to block them if renewables don't benefit the broad public. So I'm suggesting in my argument here that energy democracy is not only a better way forward, but possibly, especially for wind, possibly the only way forward. But you may challenge me on that last plane. Okay, let me talk about sunlight. Sunlight has been appropriated and claimed and harvested deliberately for thousands of years through the photosynthesis of agriculture since the early Neolithic. So we have a situation where agricultural landscapes already serve as platforms for harvesting photons, even if most farmers don't always see it that way. So the frontier for sunlight is not rural, it's actually more urban. In urban spaces, we have sunlight wasted. Here is the roof of the Mall of America in Bloomington, Minnesota. It is 96 acres. There are some skylights here, fortunately, which are illuminating the shoppers below. But all the rest of the sunlight falling here and over here, and these are covered parking lots. I believe never been to this place, but anyway, these are wasted photons. As I said, most of 96 acres is wasted. Now, the Metropolitan Council of Minnesota identified this as what they call a surface with purpose. This is their data set map of the surface with purpose. Here's the Mall of America. Here are a bunch of other surfaces with purpose. That is all part of a giant statewide database, wherein most cities can generate 25% of their electricity consumption from the surfaces identified. Unfortunately, all of those surfaces, or almost all of them, are being completely wasted right now. Oh, by the way, the term that they use in Minnesota is solar reserves, which is a term I love very much because it gives that sense of concreteness to sunlight. So these are the solar reserves that are being wasted by people by firms and corporations and entities like the Mall of America. So what can you do about that? What is the legal and moral mechanism to make sure that these reserves, these solar reserves, are used? I would say, and we can go back to the obvious thing you might say is let's socialize them, let's nationalize them. But I don't quite need to say that. I can go back to a precedent in Minnesota's history and in the history of all of the Western US, which is the settlement of that frontier. And I'll tell you a tiny bit about the most famous frontierswoman, Laura Engels Wilder. Her family settled the Dakota Territory in the 1880s, as you would have read as a kid, with a land grant made under the 1862 Homestead Act. This Homestead Act gave settlers 162, I think it says here, 162, where does it say 100? Somewhere it says 160 acres, gave them to actual settlers on condition of use. Now, the actual settler part is what interests me a great deal. An actual settler is different from a speculator. An actual settler is somebody who occupies the land, improves it, so to speak, which is to say plants something, constructs a house, lives there and grows something and makes a crop out of sunlight and land. So the Act talked mostly about that, but in Section 5, there's a bit of a stick. Everything I've described before in terms of the 160-acre grant is what you might call the carrot. But the stick is that if you don't occupy this land and use it, it reverts to government from the bottom line here. Elsewhere, they say reverts to the public domain. So that's the stick. And this is in fact exactly why Laura Engels Wilder ended up in the Dakota Territory in 1880, because her father, Pa, in the book, had put a claim for land in Minnesota and had forfeited it because he was gone for more than 6 months in the 5-year trial period. That land reverted to government, right? I would suggest that the Mall of America is in the situation of Pa, of having failed to use not the land, but the sunlight. The Mall of America has not actually settled those photons. And so one could invoke the Homestead Act, or not exactly the act because it's lapsed and it never applied to sunlight, but one could invoke this logic politically for the city of Bloomington to reclaim sunlight. All right. What would that look like? That would look like the city giving the Mall of America a period in which to put up solar panels itself as a threat. And if the Mall of America failed, then the city of Bloomington drives up with ladders and climbs up there and fixes the roof if necessary, and then installs panels and wires them to the grid, and effectively reappropriates the sunlight, not the land, not even the roof, but just reappropriates the sunlight, which the Mall of America has wasted this whole time. And the city of Bloomington could do that on the parking lots, through canopies, could do that on any surface which is not being used for illumination, agriculture, sun tanning, or generating electricity. So the great benefit of this plan is that it benefits an urban city with urban people who are, I'm not sure about Bloomington, but in much of America, urban people being people of color, it benefits the disenfranchised and marginalized people of this country to a great extent. And the critical thing here is that the land ownership then becomes separate from sun ownership, right? Unfortunately, the energy transition is not headed in this direction. I'll show you, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the, let's go back to the study that just came out from Princeton, Jesse Jacobs and his team called Net Zero America, which represents now the most detailed mapping of where solar and wind farms could go in the United States for a virtually 100% renewable grid. There's some problems though, and this, if you look deep into their criteria, which they use to make the map. I'll show you. I'm going to be showing you the map later, I think. But anyway, the criteria here are that they excluded from solar farms. They put a half-kilometer buffer around cities, 1 kilometer buffer for wind farms, and then they really excluded any place where people were living in any density at all. So it's a rural energy transition that they are imagining. And so this is their map. Bloomington is here next to Minneapolis. There are no solar and wind farms that they plan anywhere around here. They plan some out here. This is the kind of hashed light blue areas are the wind and solar farms that they plan. The existing, I think they're all wind farms, are dark blue. As the text says, this siting is largely consistent with the existing pattern. So that's a problem. I think if the energy transition remains on the path it's on, it will be conservative and it may fail. So I'm going to be recommending an energy transition in cities like Minneapolis. If you remember, George Floyd lived in Minneapolis, to provide redress and advancement for people who have been excluded from control of energy and control of many things so far. And solar homesteading is a fair and historically precedented way in which to make this frontier popularly owned and publicly owned. Okay, that's sunlight. I'm going to turn now to wind. Okay, I'm suggesting a little bit of a different policy here. I didn't use the word commons so far with sunlight because of the historical precedence of private ownership through agriculture. Wind doesn't have those precedents. It's been hardly used at all on land, used at sea by sailors, but not so much in the 20th century and thereafter. So I'm suggesting something that's a bit cut out of whole cloth, but the principle is the same here. The principle of sunlight and wind is to separate the resource from the land, so that whoever owns the land need not be the owner of the renewable resource. And this research, this is based on quite a bit of field work. The bit on sunlight is kind of thoughts of my own, I have to say. This one is based on field work. I spent 5 or 6 months in the village in Spain, which I believe is most surrounded by wind turbines. This is the Strait of Gibraltar. And this is where this village that I'll call Sereno as a pseudonym, where the Levante blowing from the east comes in, the Poniente blowing from the west comes in that way. It's a very, very windy area of the constancy of the wind is the thing that really helps you with wind power. And you end up with this village here, which is one of, by an informal survey, one of the most surrounded by wind turbines in the world. And they go way back here along this valley. And it's a lovely 400-person village or so, close to the sea. And in the view of the villagers, completely wrecked by the turbines. Turbines came 14 years ago without any support or involvement by the villagers themselves. In 2006 and 2007, they carried out civil disobedience to try to prevent the construction of wind farms. Here they are blocking a cement mixer. Their complaints were twofold. First, they, having seen wind farms at that point in other parts of Spain, they thought they would be ugly. They thought that the turbines would transform the landscape, the agricultural, rural landscape into something industrial and mechanical. They thought the turbines would kill birds and look ugly. And beneath all that, they thought the turbines would give them no economic benefits and no jobs. And they turned out to be correct in that. The people getting all once you build a wind farm, it provides very, very few jobs. The maintenance is minimal. The pollution is almost nothing. It's actually because wind carries itself to the site, and there is no pollution afterwards. There's very little for human beings to do. There's nothing to lift or to move or to carry away. So on the revenue side from benefits, the people benefiting, well, I should tell you a bit, the people benefiting are the landowners. So who are the landowners in this area? This is an area of latifundios, large scale estates, which go back to the way in which Spanish Christians conquered or reconquered this area from the Moors in the 13th century. And knightly orders carried out this conquest. And they never really moved in enough people, enough peasants, to farm the land. So it went from being an irrigated and fairly intensively farmed area under the Moors to an extensively ranched area, if that, under these large-scale landowners who are dukes or related to dukes. And Carrion, what's his name? Pascual Carrion, carried out the last study of this, which was quite a while ago in the 1930s. And these are estates of 250 hectares as a portion of land ownership. The darkest area being these large-scale latifundios of 250 hectares. And you can see this province of Cadiz is the most unequal, the greatest land concentration in the smallest number of hands here. And generally in the south and Andalusia, it's bad, much better in the north here, which is a minifundio area. But so we're talking about epic levels of inequality in land ownership, layered upon that wind farms. Okay, and so the person who owns most of the land around this village of Sereno is a guy I'll call Suarez. This is his family tree as he drew it for me. He actually didn't draw it for me. He carries it around in a notebook with him. He is descended, he believes, from Henry de Bourbon, a French king, and down here to this. These are his grandparents, if I'm not mistaken. He lives in lives in this house, Cortijo, and he owns about 10,000 hectares and raises bulls for the ring, bullfighting bulls. This is Suarez himself, not at a real match, but at a kind of trial training match, which he invited me to. So they are monarchists, they are conservatives for sure, and they are getting a double payment, what I call a double payment from the wind farms. So every turbine has a small, what they call a pad around it, which is about the size of a football field or maybe half that. That's land taken out of production. There are access roads also, which represent land taken out of production. And the operator of the wind farm pays the owner of the land something for some rent for those square meters. That's quite reasonable. But the operator also pays the owner royalties, which are not called royalties usually, but they are the same thing. They are a portion of the value of the electricity that comes out of those turbines on an annual basis. So this is basically the kinesis of wind converted into dollars, a fraction of which go to the landowner as an acknowledgement of his wind rights. And that is the phrase used, wind rights. And wind rights attached to land rights. Everywhere this has been adjudicated, this has been the case, although it hasn't been adjudicated in most countries, and it's not very well known. So this is why Suarez, this is from his website, his bull raising website, why he loves the turbines. And in fact, they have rescued his business because his bulls, although they did very well on the ring in the 50s and 60s and so on, they don't do so well lately, and he has difficulty selling them to bullfighters. And so he was on hard times until the turbines came along and rescued him. Let me tell you a tiny bit about why wind rights are associated with land rights. It goes back to a 14th century jurist called Sino da Pistoia, who lived in Tuscany. And he had to adjudicate situations where somebody built a roof line which went just slightly over the property line into the neighbor's house in urban Tuscany. Not into the neighbor's house, but covering the neighbor's garden or something. And so the neighbor lost rainfall, lost maybe sunlight, in fact, because of this overhanging roof. So Sino da Pistoia wrote something, and which is referred to now as the ad coelum principle. Ad coelum, I don't think I'm pronouncing that correctly, means to the sky in Latin. And the principle is that the landowner owns the air above that property to the sky. It's not entirely clear how many meters up the sky is, because this principle has already been breached in allowing planes to fly over everybody's land and so on. But when it comes to wind farms, the ad coelum peninsula principle gives the landowner rights to that kinesis, to the value of the kinetic energy flowing over the property. So this is why now, having observed this for about 10 years when I started the research, why people in Sereno are really angry. Here is a painting made by one of them showing the €5 bill and the financial ties to landowners and to large firms, the strings attached basically to this turbine. Okay, let me tell you a tiny bit about the village. I've told you about the big landowner who doesn't live in the village. He lives in the house I showed you. The village is actually a squatter settlement. So here is a map of the network of Via Pecuaria, of cattle trails, which are public access. They go back to the Middle Ages. And Sereno is along one of these here. And what happened in the 1950s is that people were living in the Sierra, which I showed you in the first slide up here, and they came down to this church, this thatched, grass thatched church. So hundreds of people living up in these hills came down there just to go to church and to buy things and so on, along this cattle trail. But what happened in the 1980s is that the Sierra was claimed by the military for a military reserve, and people were evicted. They didn't have legal title there. They were sent away. Where they went to was the cattle trail. And they didn't have legal title there, but that was okay. They settled there and they widened it just a little bit, and then more, and then more, and they squatted there. And what this is very common in southern Spain. There are hundreds of thousands of people squatting. Eventually, they can regularize their parcels if they pay fines, which you might call bribes, to local authorities. So Clara is one of those people living on the edge of Sereno, in the shadow of Turbines. She has no access to these turbines, no access to revenues from them. In fact, because she's a recent squatter, she's off the grid entirely and lives from some solar panels. So she's harvesting sunlight privately at her own expense, having paid for the infrastructure. I mean, she's the daughter, in fact, of a larger family, but at their own expense, when there are turbines harvesting wind blowing over her land and then over other people's land, and she gets nothing from that, and she has to live with the what you might call the aesthetic harm of turbines. And I can talk more about that in question and answer period about why people find turbines, why some people find turbines to be ugly and some people don't. So I would propose in this case that we throw out Sino da Pistoia, because his ad coelum principle never was meant to apply in this situation. And Suarez does not deserve royalties. He deserves rents for sure for the land, but he doesn't deserve royalties because he didn't make the wind. He didn't care for the wind. He didn't cultivate it. He didn't weed around it. He didn't, in fact, himself put up infrastructure for it. He's just is benefiting literally from a windfall, which he doesn't deserve. So for reasons of the public good, I think we should establish a wind commons. I've written about this actually in a little paper for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, which is a think tank, kind of an EU think tank, EU situated think tank. And if we did put up this, well, let me put it to you this way. I'm making the claim that it would be more just for Suarez to be forced to share his wind rights, and that the 400 people in this village would benefit from the turbines in their midst. And I'm making the case that that's commonsensical, because as I said, Suarez didn't do anything to deserve these wind rights. But you might say, well, the energy transition is happening anyway. Obviously, there are all these turbines around Sereno. These protesters standing in front of the cement mixers lost. So if what you care about primarily is the conditions for life on planet Earth and a rapid energy transition, then you ought to just let this happen the way it's happening quickly. And you know, the people, if a few villagers are disappointed or a few urban people are disappointed, they'll have to get over it and lump it. Okay, so I'm going to make the stronger case here that we actually need the energy transition to be just, that it's actually not going to work to build wind and solar farms in ways and in places and under systems of property wherein people are disenfranchised. But let me take you just slightly to a larger scale around Sereno. This is the original plan to put in wind turbines in the 1990s. This is where Sereno is here. And this is in fact the way it got built. This plan, though, around here failed entirely. And it failed because people got a guy called Jose Luis Tirado, who lives in this Vejer area, got a hold of the plan and brought it to the mayor of Conil, which is a town here. The mayor of Conil went through a very complicated zoning process, all with all sorts of legality. And the zoning process said that any kind of area of wetlands, any area of scenic or touristic importance, any area close to habitation would be excluded. And so It's only the beige areas, which his zoning map from about 2000 allowed for the siting of wind turbines. As it happens, this is actually the military reserve I mentioned for you. So the overlap ended up being very small. This is the beige area here. The area where they really wanted to build the turbines was this blue area, which was excluded as a touristic zone. Same thing up here. And so in this area here, very few turbines got built, just about 10 or 20. Okay, so that's what happened in the larger area around Sereno in the early 2000s, which is to say the people in Sereno lost the battle, but their interests won the war. And in fact, what's happened in Spain is that the energy transition has stalled out. It got going in the 1990s, as I said, and it hit a wall around 2010 or so. The economic crisis didn't help, but even then it hasn't really recovered. And it's cruising there around 19 or 20% of grid density. Now that may seem like a high figure compared to the US, but Spain is stuck. And in fact, it's a total failure because these are carbon emissions. These are all charts from the International Energy Agency. These are our carbon emissions, and they're actually up slightly since the 1990s. Okay, which is to say that wind turbines don't actually cut carbon emissions. What cuts carbon emissions is building lots and lots of wind turbines and taking fossil fuel plants offline. This is just for electricity. Oh, this is emissions just from the electricity. So let's see. There are two paths then. Sorry, every time I put up a slide, I have to move people's pictures and move various controls along. The Spanish path involves a small number of large projects, corporate projects in rural areas. Again, privately owned rural areas with, and I didn't talk about this quite so much, enormous public incentives and subsidies from the European Union, from the Spanish government, from the regional government. The path I'm suggesting, which doesn't need to replace the Spanish style path, it can be complementary, is a large number of small projects. And because they're small, they can be stuck in the nooks and crannies where people live, which also allows for you the benefit for resilience, that these can be islanded microgrids that provide people with emergency power close to where they live in the event of a hurricane or something else. Under public ownership, with the benefits going to the public. These are public incentives, but these are benefits coming from the public to private operators, private firms. These are benefits going to the public. Okay. So again, this is not the way things are headed in the United States. Let me go back to the question of land ownership in the US. So here is a map from Bloomberg of the top 100 private landowners and their holdings. Note, I should mention to you that the top 5 of those are white families, and they own more land than the entire African-American population in the United States. So if you wanted to create anything equal, if you wanted to create property rights for a new resource, which is what you have on frontiers, the last thing you would want to do is replicate and batten onto land ownership, because landowner ownership is so catastrophically unequal in the United States and Spain and many countries. Let's zoom in here to West Texas. So here's land ownership in West Texas. Jeff Bezos owns a bunch of land out here. This Hughes family is not related to me. They might be related to Howard Hughes. I don't know who they are. But anyway, West Texas, El Paso's right around here. This is an area of high land concentration. This is the Net Zero America plan for siting wind and solar farms, clustered here. This is what the two maps look like together. I didn't have the technology to make them overlay, but I think you can see that Jeff Bezos, the Hughes family, the Yano partners, Reynolds families, and so on, are going to benefit by having wind and solar farms sited on their land, having that revenue stream. In the case of wind, having that royalty stream as well. So let me wrap up here. I don't think this is the kind of energy transition that we should want. I don't think it's the kind of energy transition that's actually going to succeed. Because in order to succeed, the energy transition needs support from people in El Paso. It needs support from every sector of society. And it needs support from the people who've been left out of previous energy systems and energy transitions. So I'm proposing that we look at our history in the United States, that we look at alternative models from elsewhere and alternative models from sheer idealism in order to find a way to appropriate wind and sunlight, appropriate it from the frontier for the public good in terms of the conditions of life for planet Earth, but also for the public good in terms of what immediately people have as resources for their livelihoods in every social class. So let me end there. I very much appreciate any comments and questions from everybody out there.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask. I'm going to start with one from the chat from earlier and jump in if you want to clarify. This is from Skip. He asked, would the seizure of sunlight above existing buildings possibly run afoul of air rights of the landowner?
Okay, maybe that's a great question, Skip. Maybe if Skip doesn't mind, if you don't mind coming on, maybe you could say a little bit more about what kind of air rights you're talking about. Is it the right to build higher up that you're talking about, or the right of sunlight for illumination? Okay. Well, I think it's the right to build. Let's assume that they're talking about the right to build above. So that if you have a 5-story building, you may have the right to build a 6-story. I think the same principle might apply. I hadn't thought about that, Skip, so that's helpful. I think the same principle might apply, which is a use it or lose it principle. So, and again, if we rupture the ad coelum principle, then you really don't have air rights unless you're using them. So that 6-story can become a wind farm, can become solar panels, because the air right has reverted to government. Now, you know, there are this I recognize this is a very idealistic stance because I'm not an air rights lawyer, and those people would probably come up with all sorts of challenges. So what I'm really talking about is the way in which to phrase a political demand. The kinder way to say to the landowner is, you can build up, as we're going to put panels up there on top of the 5th floor, but if you want to put a 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th floor, go ahead. You just have to, at your expense, take the panels and move them up to your roof. So the panels will always go on your roof. Oh, right, and air and mineral rights, yes. So this is the principle of getting back to wind. The principle of severing wind rights from land rights would create the situation of mineral rights in most countries. So Spain and the US are a little bit unusual in that the landowner also holds mineral rights for private land. That's odd. In most countries, you know, surface rights and subsurface rights have very little to do with them. And the obvious reason for that is that the person farming or using the land made no contribution and has no real claim to the stuff far below it. You might say that the landowner also has no claim and no contribution to the stuff far above it. So basically, this question of severing rights according to verticality has a lot of precedence in a lot of countries. All right. Do you want me to address that question about trees? Hold on. Can you hear me, Kevin? Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. If you want to go just to the, if you just want to go to the next one there. with the trees, and then if anyone wants to jump in when he's finished answering a question, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'll continue to go through the chat.
Okay.
So
Let me
there's
address
the
trees.
question on trees is, if my neighbor's trees are shading my roof, effectively lowering the amount of energy that I can harvest, can I request that said neighbor compensate me for lost income?
Okay, interesting question. Again, I'm not a lawyer at all. There is a principle and a law in England referred to as ancient lights. And what that, and I love this principle because it helps my argument with respect to the Mall of America. What it says is that if there's a window and light has been falling through that window uninterruptedly for 20 years, you cannot build a story or build any structure that blocks that window. So this actually means that rights to sunlight trump air rights in England anyway, under this principle of ancient lights. And as I say, the ancient is only 20 years old. So if you apply that to solar panels, if your neighbor's tree shades your roof and has been doing so for 20 years, then your neighbor's tree has the right to that sunlight. And your neighbor's tree is actually using that sunlight very effectively for growth, if it's a fruit tree, for fruits, and of course it's fixing carbon too. So I wouldn't say that, under my principle anyway, I wouldn't say that the neighbors, that you can cut the neighbor's tree. Now, on the other hand, if the neighbor's building is shading your roof, and there's no solar panel, it's just a wall and a roof of the neighbor's building, then your neighbor is wasting sunlight. And through the municipality, I would say, go and claim that sunlight by demanding that the municipality put solar panels on top of your neighbor's roof and on your neighbor's wall, if possible, as well. Back to you, Kevin.
So there was one that you kind of answered throughout, and it was why develop areas that are still undeveloped rather than go your route so we can just effectively utilize existing structures in reference to sun. I'm going to kind of add on to that. We see in California, you get mandates that new buildings are required to have solar. Is that something maybe could be useful for, say, New Jersey? There's lots of distribution centers going up. There's one just here in Highland Park right next to the Rutgers that's huge. Should maybe we require that these new buildings that are going on what was maybe open land be required to put up these solar panels on their roofs?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, warehouses are a big part of what I'm arguing about here. And one should not be, under the principle, under the homestead principle, one should not be allowed to waste resources. So for new construction, there's an obvious rule, that an obvious logic, that panels should be put up unless, as I said, unless trees or something else is already using the sunlight. But the worst situation is where a developer cuts down a bunch of trees and puts a big warehouse or houses, and then sunlight is just falling uselessly on some kind of a surface.
And then I think we're going to get into the question you kind of mentioned about aesthetics. There was a comment about wind farms, and you talked a lot about distributing the benefits to the community. And then it ends with a question on opposition to wind projects such as that of offshore wind in New Jersey. So I guess if you kind of want to speak to what you alluded to, the objection to wind farms aesthetically, and that would be good.
Okay, so I haven't talked about offshore and offshore wind farms. I'm glad somebody brought that up. One of the reasons why we have offshore wind farms, far offshore wind farms now proposed in the Northeast, is the kind of opposition that I'm talking about. Is that everybody has a not in my backyard attitude. And the people of Cape Cod certainly had that attitude. Which is why deep water wind decided to call itself that, just to reassure the people of Block Island that they would be far off. And these New Jersey proposals will be very far off. This doesn't necessarily solve the not in my backyard problem, because of course, eventually you have to bring the electricity through cables and high tension lines onshore. And whoever is at those whatever beach community is at those interconnection points is not going to be happy at all, and may try to block the project. I don't think there's been enough attention to this matter in New Jersey. But the problem is, the other problem is that if we banish solar and wind power far away from where people live, we end up with a small number of large projects which are so massive. I mean, if you think about some of the offshore turbines now, they have the Haldane one, which is 11 or 13 megawatts, absolutely huge machines, which only a limited number of firms can afford to build at very specialized sites where they're transported by sea to a very limited number of sites. You're going to have a huge concentration of revenue and wealth in the hands of a small number of firms. You're going to have power generated so far from where people live that it's going to offer them no resilience. And they're going to be disconnected from it in a political sense and not support it, not support the energy transition where and when it needs political support. So this is why I would suggest supplementing, not necessarily replacing, but supplementing these huge projects that are far away with small projects that are close in to where people live. And that may actually require a different wind turbine design. Turbine design is a very complicated thing. One of the interesting facts, people say that large turbines are more efficient. That's not actually true, because large turbines have to be spaced farther apart in order to avoid the kind of turbulence that wears them out. So the distance between turbines should be 7 times the blade length, which means the way it works out is that you actually end up with exactly the same swept area per square kilometer. Swept area is the horizontal plane that a turbine blade is cutting through. You have the same swept area per square kilometer of horizontal area, regardless of blade length. So that means that a large number of small turbines on top of roofs in a city, based on what I've said so far, are every bit as efficient as a small number of large turbines far away from where people live in a rural area. The distinction, however, is that altitude matters and matters. And so if you can stick small turbines high up at the same level as large turbines, then they're just as efficient. There also is a question of vertical axis turbines can be packed in much more closely and put on top of buildings and things like that. So that's probably more detailed than I could explain orally anyway, but I think that gives you some idea. Next question, please, Kevin.
Yeah, I think this one's an interesting one. Chris asks, can you talk more about the principle of collective ownership of these resources and how to affect financing of renewable projects? He says, currently there is no easy way for communities, cooperatives, or other associates to develop these projects because of reliance on federal policy on tax credits.
Wow, this is spot on, because I'm part of an effort, through our union, Rutgers AAUP, AFT, part of an effort to bring either cooperative solar or community solar to Camden, New Brunswick, and Newark. Yes, the federal tax credit is a huge problem, and it exactly fits into this Spanish model, where 26% now of the costs of a project can be written off as a credit to the taxes of the developer or the operator who's made that investment. The trouble is, if you're a nonprofit or a municipality and you don't pay taxes, then you don't get to write that off. And the way that nonprofits solve that problem is they find what's called a tax equity partner, which is some private entity that pays taxes, and in fact pays a lot of taxes. The legislation says the bump from the IRS refers to entities with a large tax appetite. So they basically get that tax liability in exchange for a share of ownership. So so solar infrastructure is then filtered out from this little bit of it that might be publicly owned is filtered out to the private sector for the sake of this tax credit, which was supposed to benefit the public. Well, taxes in any case supposed to benefit the public in the first place. So I'm not sure what the solution for that is. One of the narrower ways of being a tax equity partner is that you get partial ownership for 5 years only. So you can still have public ownership for 20 of the 25 years of the project's life, and some of them may have longer lives. We'll have to wait and see. So that's a complicated answer to that question. But as I said, my proposal is really more political because in the context of the Green New Deal, I'd like Democrats and progressives to think big ideas and not to be constrained by exactly what Chris just compelled me to explain, not to be constrained by regulations like the investor tax credit, because that is something we could change.
I think here's kind of a follow-up to that question also from Chris. He was mentioning that in New York, a lot of the solar PVs are looking at brownfields or unused lands on public properties and whatnot. And he says, he asks if you can say more about the concern that implementing your principles would take too much time to put into practice through 50 state legal systems. And I think you kind of started to mention that with going through the federal system. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, you're right. The Green New Deal could actually write overriding legislation. But I want to address this question of time because my own views changed on that. You know, when I started this research in Spain 5 years ago or so, the energy transition seemed so overwhelmingly urgent that all other priorities had to fall by the way. So things like social equality and equity, you know, those are nice things to have, but we have got to get off fossil fuels now and do it as fast as possible. So just bring on the most efficient turbine you can find and stick it wherever is convenient to get with the wind blowing fast and get this thing done, right? You know, I thought like an engineer in a hurry. But I realized that that doesn't work. That those people standing in front of the cement mixer cannot just be rolled over. And so we have to do two things at the same time. We have to do the energy transition, we have to do the engineering part, and we have to do the equity part, because you can't have one without the other politically. And it may take a little bit more time, but what matters, and this what matters. The reason I showed this slide from the grid density in Spain. Spain got a very quick start. They moved very rapidly in the 90s and the 2000s, and they had the fourth highest energy density very quickly, and then they hit a wall. Now they're stuck, right? And 20% is more than we've got, but it's not good enough. If you'd want to get to 100, 20% is only 20% of the way there. So the way you start the energy transition, it sets the pattern for how far along you get, right? And so if Spain had started differently, now they'd be at 25 or 30 or 40%, right? So you have to think a little bit about the long game. Okay.
Solar or wind depend on location. That may or may not be where people are located. Should a landowner be punished for not having solar or wind collection conversion located on it? Is there an eminent domain angle?
Right. So eminent domain, that's useful. One could think about it that way. But well, actually, I will get back to this question of citing. Eminent domain is when you take something, you take, it's a takings, right? You take something from somebody that they want and they've been using. My point about sunlight falling on the Mall of the America is that the Mall of the America has not been using it, right? So the government would not actually be taking anything from them. That sunlight is an open frontier. And all that the municipality needs to do is put the panels up there to take it. So it's sort of like it's falling down uselessly on this roof. Let's intercept it with some way of using it. So I don't think eminent domain is really the right logic for this. But in questions, in terms of citing, yeah, I mean, if it was a place, and actually, you know, there aren't that many places where it's not worthwhile to put up a panel at this point because they've gotten so much cheaper and so on. But certainly there are places where it's not worth putting up a wind turbine. And, you know, those would be places that you wouldn't put up wind turbines, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Well, it looks like we're at 12 o'clock. I want to thank you for joining us today, Dr. Hughes. It was a great presentation. Remind everyone that we have another energy policy seminar series coming up at the end of April with Dr. Gabriel Chan from the University of Minnesota, who will be discussing equitable community solar policy and program design for inclusive solar development. So it should be an interesting follow-up to the discussion we just had here today.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your comments. That really got me thinking, some of them. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Kevin.